about half the room, and we are investing in startups. So actually that's my real hand. There you go, about half the room. So you've got an answer a little bit about what we're trying to do and what we've been doing since, who knows when we started this meetup? Anybody wants to try?
2016.
Yeah, that's not bad. 11. But in 2016, something really major happened, which is we started to get startups to come on stage and talk about their tech. And some of these startups started to do really, really well. It pushed me about 4 years ago to start to invest as an angel and start to think about how to take this to the next level. So the next level for us right now is that we've launched a venture fund. Quite fortunate that we have 3, just about to become 4 unicorn exited founders. We've been investing as LPs and a bunch of other exited founders. We're mostly backed by entrepreneurs basically, and we then back entrepreneurs. But the only thing that we do differently, and it's related to how we've been doing engineers and scientists meetups for so long and how we got so big, is because we backed science-based businesses. So, you know, anywhere from quantum computers, that's our last investment, a quantum networking company, to engines for aerospace and propulsions. One actually that's about to ship some stuff to Ukraine in support of our friends over there. So, you know, like all sorts of things. And of course, climate, battery recycling, and this type of technologies really drive us. Through that type of investments and thinking of industrials, battery recycling, I came across Suzanne's profile, and as you probably know, I'm quite active on LinkedIn. We started to chat, and I realized about her backstory to the point that I was like, hold on a second, there's some amazing parallels here between what I see exceptional entrepreneurs do, i.e. having a very unusual path to success and her own story. And then, because of course now she's effectively both wearing the hat of a best-selling author, having gone out and actually told her story, and we're going to actually have some books here. I read the book myself, but now is also the CEO of Exor, and then a company very active in the industrial automotive world, but also now started to go back in the investments into companies with Lingotto and Exor Ventures. So it's like, what a combination to, like Christina said, to invite her on stage, tell her story, and actually start to dive deeper about how do you overcome these challenges, how do you overcome trauma, and how do you take a path of life that might not look like nothing like the textbook says about what a founder or an investor should look like, but actually make a success out of it. So, without any further ado, please, I want to get Suzanne to join. I'm going to bring along a chair for her. Please, a big round of applause.
Great, thank you.
Right then, here we go. I think that's, we have a short video actually that I wanted to play because some of you might not have watched, well, might not have read the book, which I definitely recommend you do. And so, maybe I can do it here.
This is why I'm very glad that we've got a whole room full of technology experts.
Yeah. And
sound?
The sound is a bit... Do I have anyone from Second Home that can help? Second Home, help. Right.
We can start and come
Well, let's
back
start
to
with the
video.
introduction.
Yeah.
Whilst I saw Fergie trying to get someone. Yeah, Suzanne, do you want to just tell us a little bit more about you in general and as an intro, and then hopefully we'll fix the video in a second.
Very good. Well, the video, when we kind of come to it, will show you a little bit of original footage from the boat, so you'll get a little bit of a sense of what it was like. But essentially, I had a very odd childhood. When I was 7 years old, my father decided that he wanted to sail around the world. He wanted to follow Captain Cook around the world, actually, to be precise. I should say my maiden name is Cook, and my father comes from Yorkshire, so there were kind of tangential kind of connections. But he decided he wanted to sail around the world following Captain Cook. This was going to be a 3-year voyage, so we were going to set sail when I was 7, and we were going to be back when I was 10, and then I was going to go back to school, and everything was going to be normal again. And it was going to be a huge adventure, it's going to be very exciting, etc., etc. So we set sail when I was 7, and you'll see the boat hopefully in a moment when we get the video going. And the voyage started off kind of okay. You'll see in the book there's some kind of hints quite early on that this is not going to be quite the kind of pleasure cruise that you might have thought it might have been. In particular, my mother gets terribly seasick. I mean, on board we have me and my younger brother, who's only 6. We have my mother, who gets terribly seasick and hates sailing. We have my father, who of course is driving this kind of huge adventure, and we have 3 crew members. And in fact, over time we keep on changing crew members. No crew members stay too long on board because my parents keep on falling out with them. But we set off with 3 crew members as well. So we sail all the way down to South America, cutting a long story short, and then across to South Africa. Now, for those of you who are not sailors in the room, do we have any sailors in the room? A couple of sailors, okay. Okay. Well, normally if you're going to sail around the world, what you would normally do is you would sail from east to west. And the reason why you sail from east to west is because then you can sail near the equator and normally the winds are behind you. But we were following Captain Cook on his 3rd voyage, and for all sorts of complicated reasons, Captain Cook decided to sail the other way, which was to sail from west to east. And in order to sail from west to east, you have to go really far south, because the winds go the other way, but only if you go really, really far south. So we went all the way down to South America, and then across the southern Atlantic Ocean, which is a very rough ocean. The oceans get really rough when you get to the kind of very far north or very far south, for a few different reasons, but in particular there's no big land masses there to kind of break up the waves, so they just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and also you get quite high winds. So that was a very bad trip, and then we set off across the southern Indian Ocean, which is the ocean between South Africa and Australia, and that's probably the most dangerous ocean in the world. By this point, it's still me, age 7, my little brother, age 6, my mother, who hates sailing, my father. By this point, we have 2 novice crew on board, my father having fallen out with the kind of previous set. Halfway across the Indian Ocean, we get very badly shipwrecked. We get hit by an enormous wave. We end up on a tiny atoll in the middle of the Indian Ocean. I end up with quite a bad injury. I'm kind of thrown against the wall of the hull when this wave hits us and against the ceiling. So I end up having multiple head operations on this island without any anaesthetic, I hasten to add, because if you're on an atoll in the middle of the Indian Ocean, you can't find any anaesthetic.
I remember that part actually with the French doctor, right? And it was all like, it felt very rough. And I was like,
yeah. So I won't, we will come into more of this, but to kind of, basically this voyage then goes on for, it takes a decade before I finally managed to get off this boat. A decade in which there's very limited schooling, very limited kind of access to other kids, and my relationship in particular with my mother kind of nosedives, from the point at which I become a teenager. So it becomes a really, really difficult, toxic kind of environment. And that's what the book is about, because, about halfway through this, I decide I'm going to try and escape from this, what it literally is a kind of never-ending voyage, and eventually I do. Yeah, so I have I come back to the UK and I get myself into university, so to give you the kind of punchline at the end. But it's a very crazy childhood with all sorts of things missing, and we'll come on to, pros and cons of that sort of strange childhood.
Great, all right, so I think we are nearly there with the video.
Good.
Wait, what was that?
That was fine.
when you can hear the music. But anyway, I think we've got the
It's
gist.
very emotional.
I mean, the first rows probably were okay. How about the back? I take all the blame for it. And now I'm going to just reshare so we get back to Suzanne here. There you go. Cool. All right. So actually, what happened after?
What happened after? Oh, well.
Well,
you mean
actually, let's start.
after the boat.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. You were already starting to hinting about university, but even that was quite challenging because there was a lot of uncertainty even getting to university. I remember reading that. So, how do you actually? Because on the book you say, but like, how do you actually manage to get through? What was the whole emotion? 'Cause I remember the school, like trying to get ready, trying to even get to. And when you were in the UK, you were still not 100% sure, right? You had your interview and they had to pick you, and you didn't know. So you kind of got a one-way ticket to escape, but you were not even sure if the escape would work out. So how was working through it?
So the biggest issue that I kind of faced on this boat, I realised by the time I got to like 12 or 13, so I haven't by that point really been to school properly since I was 7. And I obviously reading books that we have on the boat, but I mean we're basically on a boat sailing around, so you're not able to go to school or anything like that. I decided, I don't know where I got the idea from, but I decided that my only way of getting off this boat was to somehow find a way to educate myself. But it's quite hard to do, and you've got to remember, I'm afraid we're kind of pre-internet, kind of pre-mobile phones. We basically got post. I mean, that's it, or talking to somebody in person. I realise for some people in the room that may be a kind of crazy idea, but that's literally all. And on a boat, of course, we had very primitive experience equipment. We didn't obviously have a phone. Most of the time, we had a fridge right at the end. We didn't have any satellite navigation. I mean, it was very, very basic on board. So we finally got to Australia, by which point, we were in Hawaii when I was 12. That was supposed to be the end of the trip because that's where, those of you who know your Captain Cook stories, Captain Cook was killed in Hawaii on his 3rd voyage. So that was supposed to be the end point of our voyage. We were a year late, so we were 4 years in. But my father decided to keep sailing. In fact, we had a family vote, and my brother and I voted to come home, and my father and my mother voted to keep sailing. My father announced that it wasn't actually a democracy after all, and we were going to keep sailing. So we kept sailing. We finally got to Australia, and I managed to go to school for about kind of 10 months or so. And then my father announced we were going to keep sailing, because he just loved sailing, and this was a lifestyle that he just really enjoyed. At that point, I managed to convince them to let me enroll in a correspondence school. There's a correspondence school in Australia. But the problem with that, if you're living on a boat, I mean, it was my only option, but the problem is, on a boat, you don't have an address. And that's the one thing you need if you're trying to study by correspondence, is you need somewhere where the school is going to send you stuff and you can send it back. So instead, what I would do is I would, post off all my lessons every time we got to a port. And then I'd try to get my dad to tell me where we were going to go to next. And sometimes we did go to that place next, but quite often we didn't, or we hit a storm and we went somewhere else, or something else happened. But one way or another, I tried to educate myself kind of that way. And meanwhile, by this point, we'd run completely out of money. I should say we were never a very wealthy family at all. But by this point, we're completely broke. And so we're taking crew on board the boat and getting them to pay to come on the boat to have like little mini holidays. And that was how my parents were funding this trip. But that meant that they really wanted me to work on board, cooking and cleaning for these crew. And my brother, I'm afraid it was a very gendered world. So my brother was, able to help when he felt like it on deck, but I was expected to kind of cook and clean down below. It was very, very gendered. So I would go and hide when I could, when I wasn't being dragged into doing chores, up in the forepeak at the front of the boat, and try to study and then send these things off. And then eventually, when I was 16, my parents basically left me and my younger brother, who was 15, in New Zealand, and they kept sailing, and they just left us behind. And that was the most, and I describe it in the book, that was the most difficult year for me, because I didn't know any other. I only knew one adult in New Zealand who lived in Auckland, and we were dumped in Rotorua. So I didn't know anybody. I wasn't going to school, and I was still trying to teach myself because I'm still determined. My way out of this thing is to get myself to university. And then I write to every university I've ever heard of in the world. And it's quite funny because the universities I'd heard of course, even if you live on a boat, you've kind of heard of Harvard and you've heard of Oxford. So I wrote, so they ended up being all the elite universities, not because I thought I was elite, but those are the ones I'd heard of. So I wrote to Auckland University, Auckland, New Zealand, and kind of Sydney, because of course that's local to there. And they gradually started writing back, and they were all saying no. So New Zealand said no because I have a British passport, so I couldn't go to New Zealand. Australia for the same reason. Harvard never wrote back, and I now realise that Harvard University, Harvard America is not the right address. Which, by the way, is a real flaw for Harvard. For anyone sitting in a hut in New Zealand trying to make up what the address is, it doesn't work.
They definitely lost you to somewhere else.
Yeah, they lost me, because I think that's probably more my loss than theirs. But anyway, and then amazingly, Oxford wrote back and said, okay, well, write us a couple of essays and we'll think about it. So I wrote them a couple of really quite crazy essays because I was really worried about the fact that here I am, I'm sitting in a hut in New Zealand on my own. I haven't seen a teacher I've never met any of my teachers in person. So I'm trying to do 6 subjects because I was doing the Australian curriculum, and I was conscious that in the UK you only did 3 at that point in time. So I couldn't do a standard essay. So I wrote a couple of, and I want to study science. I want to do study biology. So I wrote one essay on how to do science at sea, which was quite kind of entertaining. You know, if you want to do a dissection and you're living on a boat, you first have to catch a frog. So I described how I kind of caught my frog and chopped it up on my mother's chopping board and all the rest of it. And then I had another slightly odd essay about whether or not humans are a domesticated animal, which I just thought was so obscure as a topic, nobody else would have written that. Anyway, amazingly, they wrote back and said, if you can get yourself to England, we'll interview you. And so I went and picked kiwi fruit, which, by the way, I do not recommend. That is a horrible thing to go and do. They're really heavy, and all the hairs on them kind of come off, and they're really horrible. Anyway, I earned enough money for a one-way ticket back to the UK, and I came back, did the interview, and amazingly, they let me in. And the incredible thing about education is, if that happens, it transforms your life, because the really odd thing is, I then get to Oxford. There's a whole nother issue about how I was going to get any sort of money to fund myself, which I describe in the book. But anyway, I get to Oxford, and nobody ever seems to ask you really about what happened beforehand. They all just assume that you've come from some privileged background and gone to a school and all of this stuff, and so you kind of then continue on in life, which I've done, and done in many ways quite kind of conventional things. And we'll come on to it, but I think some of that experience, that crazy childhood experience, has helped me. Some of it has not helped me. There's been kind of big disadvantages, but there's definitely been advantages and disadvantages.
Okay, and actually that's a great segue, because like I mentioned before, and Christina even mentioned before, and when you go through challenges, especially huge challenges, what I've realized in my fairly short actually career as an investor and before as a software engineer is that sometimes actually you get the craziest people that do the most amazing things, but there is a downside. Like, it's not just, oh yeah, it's challenging and then you win and you know it in advance. So like, first of all, you don't know, right? So you're constantly living in a state of uncertainty, and then there is the whole dealing with it, which I think when we spoke actually before the event, not everybody manages. So sometimes there is that survivor bias that today we're here sitting and talking about it, and you've had even the courage to describe it in a book that people can actually read and learn from, but not everybody can. And you've done some research, right, on this. So can you tell us more about that? The downsides and the issues that come with it.
Yes, you're right on both points. I should say I haven't done the research, but I've kind of looked at what the research is, because I'm quite intrigued, because people say to me, well, hang on a moment, Suzanne, you seem quite normal, which I suppose is quite reassuring. I suppose none of us really feel that normal, but clearly I can. When you go and look at the research, there's 2 kind of interesting things that come out. First of all, there's quite a lot of evidence that a fair amount of people who are very successful have had difficulty in their background. So there was a book that came out, which I've been reading, about British Prime Ministers, for example. You know, like them or loathe them, it's amazing how many of them had a very difficult childhood. You know, they lost a parent, or they ended up, you know, they were ill, or something else really quite traumatic happened. Many more than you would expect if you just took a kind of random section. So that's the kind of first thing, which is quite interesting. And interesting for you guys if you're hiring people. You know, if somebody has got themselves out of that sort of background, often they end up quite able to overcome future obstacles as well. And then the second thing is there's some really interesting longitudinal studies looking at kids who've had really difficult childhoods. And one I was sent, they actually followed for 40 years a set of kids in Hawaii who came from really difficult backgrounds. You know, these are kids who grew up in families where there was alcoholism or drug abuse or just great poverty or whatever. All of them were really bad. And two things are really interesting from that. One is 3/4 of them were obviously really badly affected for lots of their life, and they measured being impacted by both they weren't holding normal relationships, having normal relationships, but also their careers were not what you would expect, kind of given everything else. Who knows what was going on in their heads? They weren't kind of looking at that. The good news is, of those 3/4, about half of them got back on track by the end of the 40 years, but still. But the really interesting thing is, a quarter you couldn't tell when you looked at, you know, what they did in terms of career success and relationships and other things. And of course, we don't know why that is. And as a, you know, at least an ex-scientist, I'm very conscious that, you know, when you start to look at the things that are the characteristics of that quarter, you get into kind of correlation, you know, rather than causation. But it does seem that if you're able to make other relationships outside of your family group in a very traumatic childhood, you can actually come out a little bit protected. And funnily enough, on the boat, these crew members who kept on appearing and disappearing in my life, some of them I actually did form some quite strong bonds with, you know, particularly one who I still know very well. I always call him Mr. Ray. My parents used to insist when I was a kid that adults were called Mr. So to this day, Mr. Ray is Mr. Ray. I still address him as Mr. Ray. So two things. One is there are a large proportion of successful people who've come from remarkably difficult backgrounds. And secondly, unfortunately, most people who come from difficult backgrounds are badly impacted by it. So you wouldn't inflict it on somebody, but if people get out of it, they can be very successful.
Okay, well that's, you know, again, you've got to take the good and the bad side and be, you know, and I guess reckon with it, because you wouldn't want to inflict it on someone, but if someone can get out, then, you know, sometimes having that checklist that people have to go through to even apply for a job maybe is meaningless. And there is another aspect of that meaninglessness, which is, you mentioned, you know, you went to effectively study science, biology, and I remember something at the beginning of the book, which you were actually telling through your, you know, more kid than teenage eyes, and there was actually a lot of curiosity. And I remember, this was a couple of months ago, so let's see if I get it right, but with your brother, you were actually kind of almost the most curious / kind of taking, I mean, the role in the boat, that kind of looking at your dad and trying to do more in a way. Your dad maybe was more like maybe expecting your brother to be that person, and then it didn't really happen, and you constantly wanted to do more. Do you think that was what also potentially amongst the reasons led you to this curiosity, get into science and wanting to more? And then do you see any parallels with that, with that, and what then happened later? I.e., you know, you didn't have a straightforward career that an executive would be expected to have, you know, in a linear way, but you did end up as CEO of Exor. So do you think that kid curiosity, that kind of thing, and then going to study science, how was that impacted where you are today and the views that you have today, especially when you maybe compare yourself with other executives that maybe don't come from that background?
Yeah, I certainly think one of the things that I learned as a kid, I mean, I was a very curious kid. I was kind of always asking questions in kind of a slightly annoying way, I suspect. I did learn that you can teach yourself things, that if you kind of remain really curious, it's amazing what you can learn. I mean, I self-taught myself, and I don't think I've ever really lost that. You know, that kind of, if you can retain kind of curiosity and just keep learning stuff, it's really interesting. I did a cybersecurity course recently because it was just, and I got quite fascinated by it. I mean, I love learning things to this day, and that definitely has stood me in good stead. You know, I kind of, and that's one of the reasons why I've been willing to do different things in my career as well, because when you move, you get an opportunity to learn something really quite different. And at Exor, we have a number of companies in very different industries, and I love that because I get the opportunity to learn and become quite deep in what I know, but in a range of different industries, which is great. So I think that kind of learning mindset I had to teach myself, otherwise I was never going to escape. And you also learn to bounce back from things because you have to. You know, there was nobody kind of watching out for me, and therefore you had to kind of learn to pick yourself up.
Okay, and I guess in that process, maybe to even manage to escape and take the curiosity to the next level, you must have also challenged, I guess, authority. So how was that part? You know, family challenge, you know, issues within families, traumas that come with the challenging within a family. I mean, do you want to also share some of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the kind of interesting things, hopefully people will find in the story is actually, it's not really a sailing story. I mean, it's on a boat, but it's not really a sailing story. It's really a story about what happens if you take a family and stick them in a very small environment for a decade. And it's a very different thing getting on a boat when you're 7 years old and getting off a boat when you're 16. And as I say, the kind of family relationships started to deteriorate. And one of the interesting things as I've kind of talked to people about the book is how many people have family relationships which are really quite difficult. And we often don't talk about them. So it is...
And especially on different skills. I mean, I'm sure if you're an entrepreneur, the first time you tell your parents, like, oh, I'm going to leave everything and my safe job and I'm just going to, who knows, do something. Normally it's not exactly easily accepted, especially in certain backgrounds.
No, it's not easy at all. So that's kind of interesting. I'm kind of coming to terms with that. And then I think the other thing is, you know, I grew up in a very kind of strange world where, you know, my father was the only point of authority in my world. And he was very authoritarian because there's something about being the captain of the boat. I mean, you have complete control over everyone's lives on this boat. And my father, like many captains, you know, I think quite enjoyed that control. I mean, he often wouldn't tell us where we were going next. I remember once when we set sail from Fiji, and we were either going to go to Tonga or Samoa, and I wanted to know which one because my schoolwork was going to go to one or the other, and he just wouldn't decide, or else he just wouldn't tell us. And it was only when we were about halfway there that he suddenly said, by the way, we're going to Tonga. So he had ultimate control over the family. But when I kind of got to an age where I was willing to take my father on, and I didn't do it directly, I did it kind of obliquely because I couldn't really do it directly. What I realised is that, you know, authority, it's kind of important, but you don't have to kind of live your life constrained by it. And I think for me that's been really helpful in my career because, you know, I am willing to challenge the status quo. You know, I'm kind of willing, you know, at many points people have said to me, well, you shouldn't really do that next, Suzanne, or kind of, I'm not sure that's the right, and I will quite often go against what people tell me you should or shouldn't be doing, partly because I think I grew up slightly outside of society, so I'm willing to kind of challenge what's seen as the conventional thing to do.
Okay, so now taking all of these, I guess, lessons that you've learned, what do you think are the best ones, the ones that are you actually maybe even go back and refer to in your daily life now, and maybe even professional life now? Do you think if there is anything you want to share?
Yeah, well, I should say there's huge disadvantages of coming from this sort of background, particularly kind of educationally. There were loads of gaps that I had to fill in, and socially as well. When I first came to university,
especially I guess at Oxford. Because again, maybe that also, like, because the book doesn't get as far, but the acceptance, maybe, I mean...
Yeah, no, well, we can talk about that. I mean, it was really tricky when I first came back, kind of socially in particular. But having put all those things to one side and having kind of worked my way through those, there are kind of definitely advantages. One is this kind of learning mindset. Another one is a willingness to challenge the status quo, because you kind of live, I just didn't grow up in a very formalized way, in that sort of way. The word resilience is overused, but for me, I think I am very resilient, and I think the reason is that when I face a challenge, it sounds ridiculous in a way, but it is actually true. When I face a challenge, I do actually think back to being 7 years old on a boat in the middle of the Indian Ocean, being hit by a wave, and think, okay, whatever it is I'm facing, kind of day to day, whatever challenge with the companies that we work with or whatever it is, it's not as bad as that. And that enables me to put things into proportion. And I think if you can learn to put things into proportion, then you can actually get through a lot of things. And my theory is that one of the reasons why if people manage to escape from quite difficult backgrounds, one of the reasons why they can become successful is because they have that ability to put things into proportion. I mean, if you've grown up in a family with alcoholic parents and you've had to escape from that, when you face a challenge, you're going to understand whether something really is big or whether it's kind of small. So there's been a whole bunch of things, I think, from my childhood that have been helpful. As I say, I wouldn't recommend it to anyone because most people don't escape from those situations, but there's definitely upside. So I would, as I say, I would encourage you, if you're thinking about people on your teams, it's worth considering people from slightly unusual backgrounds.
Okay, and how do you reconcile, I guess, the two sides today? As in, I guess you wouldn't be here potentially if that didn't happen, but at the same time, you say you wouldn't want to inflict it onto someone. So how do you how do you balance the unfairness potentially of it with the fact that it may have potentially enabled you to, meet the your late husband or the family that you have, your kids, your position. You see what I'm saying? Like how have you reconciled it, or the book doesn't get that far? I'm just curious now.
Well, I think both things can be true. So it can both be the case that, if somebody asked me, I did a podcast, and it's quite an interesting podcast where they interview people who've had difficult childhoods, and you tell the story of the difficult childhood. I think it's called something like Things I Wish I Knew or something like that. And I think they've done lots of these podcasts. I was like guest number 70 or something. And towards the end of the podcast, they said to me, what would you tell yourself if you could go back and talk to your 7-year-old self? And I said, I'd tell myself to write down the names and addresses and phone numbers of every relative in the UK. And when it gets really bad on that boat, I'd tell myself to go and ring one of them and get off the boat and go home. Because, of course, I didn't have any contact with any of my relatives. I had no direct contact with them. I barely knew them. So I had nowhere to go. At one point, I run away from the boat. It's in the book. And then sit there and think, well, what am I going to do? I don't have a passport. I don't have any money. I don't know anybody. So where am I going to go? What am I going to do? And so I have to go back. And it was funny. At the end of this podcast, they said, that's really strange. They said, in everybody else who we've interviewed, you're the first person who said that. Everybody else has said, don't worry. I tell myself you're going to get through it. It's all going to be okay. So in terms of reconciling it, I both believe that if I could have made it not happen, I certainly would have told myself to kind of get out of there. But I can simultaneously understand that having escaped from it, it gave me strengths. So I think those two things for me are not in conflict. I can kind of accept that there were strengths while still believing that it was not something that I would inflict on anyone else. I have 3 kids of my own, and I should.
I was gonna say, how are you now dealing with your kids? I mean, obviously it's not sticking them in a boat.
My kids, for a start, have refused to get on a sailing boat. They know enough about my background. They don't want anything to do with it.
Okay, well, that's it's obviously I agree. You had something to think, in a way, like you've had this very unique journey, and then you become a parent yourself, and now you're sort of having to decide what parent you want to be, type of thing, And that's a big challenge because ultimately, our children will be the ones that carry forward the war. So as much as I say, we invest in amazing technology. Actually, I just realized as you were talking, that chip there is the company we go invested with. It's totally random. It's not on purpose. This poster has been printed like 2 months ago. It's the quantum photonics chip manufacturer that Exor Ventures and our fund invested in. But yeah, that's part of the future. But also our children are the ones that are going to potentially use it, develop it, and build it. And so especially when you come through that journey, you've got to decide what parent you want to be, right? Because you cannot just copy your parent if you don't agree, but also maybe you want to take the good sides of what you've learned. How do you potentially, how are you sort of thinking about this when, you want to grow your kids?
Yeah, so I remember when my husband and I were talking about having kids, we had the kind of conversation that, I don't know how many people in this room have this conversation, but I suspect lots of people have this conversation where you say, okay, if we become parents, what sort of parent will we want to be? And my husband grew up in perfectly kind of normal, kind of middle class British household in York, and had I knew his parents very well. Sadly, both have passed away now, but lovely, kind of straightforward parents. Not perfect. They were not particularly well off, but a kind of nice, kind of normal kind of family. So his thing is he wanted to be closer to our kids than his father had been to him, because one generation back, parents tended to be a bit more absent. But for me, it was a much more fundamental conversation, because there was very little from my parents that I wanted to replicate. But I did have some of these other role models that I wanted to copy. So Mr. Ray, for example, on this boat, who's quite a character. There was a woman who looked after me for a couple of weeks in Auckland, New Zealand, before I came back to the UK. So I'm afraid they were only very briefly in my life, but they were in my life enough for me to think, okay, why did I feel so safe with these people? And why, what was it about it? And actually, one of the very good conclusions from this, so I concluded the things that I thought were important about being a parent. By the way, if my kids were here, I'm sure they'd tell you all my failings as a parent. But anyway, we're very close as a family, so hopefully that nets off. But anyway, one of the things I concluded, which actually was very helpful for me as a woman going into wanting to work, was I concluded it's not about being there the whole time. Because my parents were there the whole time. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, my parents were there. But they didn't give me unconditional love. They weren't really concerned about my welfare. I think I only saw a dentist once in 10 years. I can't remember seeing a doctor. We were often hungry. We ran out of water several times. So for me, I suddenly realised it's not about being there the whole time. It's about all those other things. It's about unconditional love, being there when they need you to be there, kind of putting their interests, not necessarily first, but at least on the map. And funnily enough, that was quite helpful, because I realised actually that's all compatible with being a working parent or working mother. So I have worked I've always tried to make sure that I'm home at weekends, and I'm kind of often there in the evenings, but less so now because my kids are now 22, 20 and 20, so frankly they don't really want me around too much. But
Great. Okay, so we touched on the personal, lessons, and you actually already anticipated a little bit on the hiring. So you managed to go through Oxford, you went through your career, and now you're looking at the world, and you are having to make hiring decisions and management decisions that eventually also get into investment decisions at the end. Even though obviously it's a massive team. How do you now, with everything learned, you've seen how you deal with your kids. How do you deal with this too? Like Exor, you are actually also on the board on some big industrial groups, so like you're having to advise companies at very high stake levels, and we are in a deep tech community that is all about industry. So on that front and on the hiring fronts, are there any practical, besides being open-minded, things that you can take from?
Yes, I should say Exor is really very small. We are like a kind of like, we're an investment company, and then we tend to be the anchor shareholder in different companies. But at a kind of Exor level, we're relatively small. So we don't make a lot of hiring decisions because there's just not very many of us. Obviously, the companies do lots of hiring, but I rarely get kind of involved there, apart from kind of senior level hires sometimes. I think for me, the kind of biggest thing from all of that is this resilience thing. I had to step in to be the CEO of one of our big industrial companies during COVID, and the fact that I had that very difficult childhood actually was incredibly helpful, because it enabled me to stay very calm when we were going through a pretty difficult period. We had to close plants down all over the world and then figure out how to open them all up, and all the rest of it. Everyone here lived through that as well. But for me, it was pretty stressful, because if you're CEOing a company, you feel like a lot of people are depending on you making sensible decisions. So that has been really helpful. That ability to stay calm when things are difficult is, and I do think it's because I've come out of a difficult background that has kind of given me that, when things get really tough, I kind of get quieter and calmer and just listen more to people around me.
Cool. All right. So just before we get into the Q&A, some quick questions on. Well, you've been a curious person throughout your life. What are the things that pique cybersecurity? You mentioned one. What are the things that pique your curiosities now? In general.
Oh, kind of everything. So I still subscribe to New Scientist. So not Nature. I found that a bit heavy going, but I still love science. I'm pretty obsessed with kind of politics. But my late husband was cabinet secretary here in the UK, so I basically had a lot of kind of indoctrination into kind of UK politics. So very interested in kind of politics, not just in the UK, but kind of more, and geopolitical stuff as well, I think find really interesting. And of course, we live in a moment where that is so important to try and understand as best you can, because it has an impact on everybody. Even small companies, the things that are happening geopolitically have a big impact. So I tend to read a lot, and I still read a lot of books. So lots of different things, really. Yeah, I'm lucky enough. One of my roles is I'm on the board of the Economist newspaper. So that's great, because then therefore I feel that part of my job is I should be reading The Economist, which is great. Because it is quite a good way to figure out things that are happening and really in places that you wouldn't otherwise necessarily read about. So if I read the UK press, it tends to be very UK centric. But if you read The Economist, it will suddenly give you this is what's happened in the Nigerian election, or this is what's happening in kind of Pakistan, and that's really interesting.
We've got two practical tips, New Scientists and Economists. I was going to go into Q&A, but because you said politics, I'm going to have to ask one last question. Start to get ready with yours, because that's coming. We are a startup community. I'm Italian, I live in the UK. I think the UK so far is probably the best in Europe in terms of community. Still a lot to catch up to the US. You've got experience on both sides. I mean, Exor's got links to the US. It's Netherlands based, originally actually from a family that came from Italy, because it all started with the Agnelli family and the Fiat Group. Where do you see this going though? Because Brexit happened, now we're, like Fergie said, we're going back into Horizon, so and then the whole geopolitics starting to split. How do you manage that in your decisions, and where do you see potentially going, and how could it impact small companies that are growing, and maybe Exor might invest or might not invest, but still they're part of an ecosystem that now it's deglobalizing, and even within the clusters there are some potential conflicts and reconciliations. UK, Europe, friends, enemies, friends again, like US. What do you think?
So Exor, as you say, has Italian roots. It's listed in the Netherlands. And the way in which we think about it is it's really important for each of our companies to do what's right for that company. So different companies are in different places. So some of our companies are obviously kind of based in Italy. But one of our companies is Ferrari. Ferrari is based in Italy, Maranello, as you probably know. Juventus Football Club, based in Italy. It will always be an Italian company. More recently, we bought a share of Philips Healthcare. So Philips is a Dutch company, and I think will always be a Dutch company. It's in fact, we went and visited Philips this week. I went to go and visit them, and we actually went to the original house of one of the founders of Philips, which it goes back in the Netherlands for a very long time. So The Economist is based in the UK. So our companies are based where it makes sense for our companies to be based. As Exor, we're most familiar with investing in Europe and the US. They tend to be kind of areas that we know best, and we're most familiar with.
Okay, I mean that was kind of your passion in politics. Do you think also what do you think? I mean, that's obviously personal opinion. It's not representing Exor or anything, but. Where do you think this world is going in terms of the supply chains being disrupted and falling apart, and politics being a bit crazy? That's merging your curiosity, your reconciliation, personal life. Exor experience and personal political passion? Where do you think we're heading?
Well, it's interesting. I think, and I was having this discussion the other day. I mean, we live in a very turbulent time at the moment, and I don't need to tell anybody that. I mean, we all know that. We have a lot of we have a lot of geopolitical turbulence. We have a lot of uncertainty. We've got a huge number of elections this year coming up, which is going to potentially change the shape of kind of geopolitics quite significantly. What's interesting though is I think we all tend to be a little bit biased by the last kind of 20 or 30 years, which actually, in retrospect, when you think about it, have been incredibly stable on our planet. I mean, we had the financial crisis and we have had some wars, but nothing like what was happening beforehand. I mean, actually, unfortunately, what is more usual is have quite a lot of disruption. And one of the jobs, I think, as working on a kind of startup, being a kind of founder, or doing what I do, is we have to try and navigate this as thoughtfully as possible. But I think we also have to accept that that is how our world is going to be. We can't wait for everything to suddenly go back to being calm. We need to understand that the world is quite a turbulent place. So all of our companies are thinking about their supply chains. They've all kind of, that's become ever more clear, particularly post-COVID. All of our companies are kind of thinking through how they navigate a difficult kind of geopolitical situation. But I think that's normal. I mean, I don't think we should kind of wait, as I say, I don't think we should wait for it to end. That's the world that we live in. There's still many kind of interesting and exciting things for companies to do.
Yeah, and actually I think I could see a total parallel, because when I was going through the book, I mean, the grit through uncertainty was one of the things that was constant. You've got this constant, literally, grit of persistence through an uncertain, you kind of know what happens at the end because we know you're here, but if you ignore that part, sometimes you're like, wait, what's going to happen now? The boat is like cracked, there is water in, anyway, so definitely that. I think it's a good connections, the fact that navigating a company in those areas can be quite similar to navigating a life as a child stuck on a boat, doesn't even potentially know where she is going next. And on that, let's start with questions.
Me?
Yes, why not?
Okay.
Actually, I have one here, ready for this moment.
Thanks.
So, let's start with mine, I'll switch this on.
Thanks. The first question, what should I do to take this book?
I think the second-hand bookshop. There's going to be copies
I want
outside.
this one from her hand.
I'm very happy at the end of it, so anybody wants me to sign some copies of the book, I will go and kind of sign them at the end. Very happy to do that.
Yeah, so the question, sorry.
Oh, by the way, watch out with that, so you back. No. Where you were before.
Good.
Just basically.
Okay.
Yeah, watch out.
I'm radio physics. So.
Same on this side when it comes to you.
Well, the only one thing that I believe we can learn from right people is that learn how to learn. I believe that you invented your own educational system. Not perfect probably, but good enough to run through university and drive such like a powerful business. So could you please share with us your 3 main principles how to educate yourself?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. How do you educate yourself? So I think when I want to kind of learn something new, I think the most important thing is to be very clear what it is that you want to learn. This sounds really. The problem is when you say it, it sounds kind of so kind of obvious in a way. But you need to be very clear what you want to learn. You need to be incredibly focused on it. You really. It's so easy in day-to-day life. You know how we all sit on Zoom calls and there's 15 different things going on, and you're checking your emails. The fact of the matter is, none of us are any good at multitasking. So if you really want to learn something, you have to focus. And focusing means that is the only thing that you have to do when you're kind of learning. What I have discovered is you can learn in quite small bite-sized bits of time, actually, and I find for my brain that works quite well. So I can say to myself, okay, when I decided to kind of do this cybersecurity thing, because it's such an important topic for our company, so I wanted to learn it. So I did a Google cybersecurity thing. It was fun actually. But you know, I could do it. I could kind of sit down in the evening, having finished everything up, and then spend half an hour really focusing on it and kind of going through. And of course, nowadays it's so much more accessible than sitting on a boat, because now I can do a kind of online course and it's got little videos and quizzes and all that. So it's much more easy. But the principle of be very clear what you want to learn, really kind of focus on it. And then I think the other thing for me is I've learned that you can achieve incredible things with quite a small amount of time, so long as you do it kind of pretty much every day. So it's very daunting when you're kind of looking at a task like, okay, I want to teach myself a language, or I want to kind of learn cybersecurity, or whatever it is. That feels pretty daunting, particularly because we all have things that we're doing during our days. But actually, 15 minutes every day doing something adds up. And that's how I wrote the book, by the way, because it took me a while to write the book. But I was working the whole time, and kind of sadly I lost my husband halfway through kind of writing it as well. But I found that if I kept on just doing a little bit every day, kind of gradually building this kind of mountain, and then the thing with writing books is you build a mountain, then you cut it in half, because most of it, you can get a huge way. So I think kind of knowing what you want, being really focused when you're doing it, and then, you know, not being too worried about only doing 10 or 15 minutes every day, you know, just kind of building it up. It's incredible what you can learn.
Thank
Yes.
Hi. Knowing now what we know with your background, growing up in the boat and making maybe some decision instinctively, you or your family in the situation, and then you changing your course and 17, 18 going into more of a scientific, data maybe driven. When you're making these decisions today, what's data driven and what is more instinct? Did it have an influence at all?
It's an interesting question. I think I'm very logical in my thinking. I definitely think I am. So I think my kind of primary way of making a decision is very logical. But what I have learned, not so much kind of leaving the boat, but actually as I've progressed in my career and become more senior, is actually there's a lot of decisions that you need to make as a business person which you cannot make just on data. Because a lot of the biggest decisions that we need to make are around people and around behaviors. And those are not always data-based. You know, you're observing how someone behaves and whether or not, you know, you feel comfortable with how they're behaving, or you're looking at how a team operates and trying to work out whether a team is working well. And these are not so much data, you know. So I think I've increasingly realized that you want to get as many facts as, well, the other thing is, as you get more senior, the other thing is that you often don't have every fact that you would love to have in order to make a decision. When I was CEO of one of our companies during COVID, I was having to make decisions really quickly. And a lot of those decisions, we didn't have enough time to get every fact that you would love. So you have to get somewhat comfortable with a degree of ambiguity. So I think my natural decision-making style is very fact-based, but I've learned, you know, through my career that you have to also be, you know, somewhat more subjective. Facts become very more and more important, and you don't always have every fact. And so actually instinct does become quite important. But for me, instinct is about recognizing repeated patterns. You know, there's things that you learn are markers of, you know, if I feel uncomfortable in a situation, you learn to kind of recognize what it is that's kind of causing that.
We've got more question coming from the back.
Thank you. I have the opportunity to meet Lady Suzanne last year. So I mean, I already knew the story, but still, it's, you know, every time I hear it, it's very fascinating. I cannot recommend enough the book, and I also share the view of the moderator, which is this, you know, constant sense of tensions while you're reading, which keeps you like, you know, page turner, as they say in the, you know, publishing industry. And I think it's a very good, say, management manual book at the end, even if, like, you know, through the personal story. But now I'm curious about this book about UK prime ministers coming from a dire backgrounds. What's the name of the book?
It's a very good question. I should admit at this point I'm also dyslexic, I think. So I can't actually remember, but I will send you the name of the book. It's sitting on my bookshelf because I'm halfway through it. I will send it to you.
Okay, thank you.
I think if you Google, by the way, you'll probably find it. But I will send Francesco the name of the book.
Thank you. So one of the things I struggle with, I've got 2 young kids, and what driven me was my chip on my shoulders to prove people wrong, the grit to come through, yada yada yada. But my kids go to private school. They've got what I could afford to make them a very comfortable life. What I struggle with is, am I making them complacent? Would they have the same grit? So that's a constant struggle for me, and I'm curious to get your point of view to say, and obviously your kids went through it, and how did you deal with it, or was that even a question, or am I overthinking it?
No, I think it is a question that as a parent it's worth asking ourselves, because you don't want it to be a very difficult childhood, because, as I say, 3/4 of people who kind of have very difficult childhoods end up very badly impacted. However, if you solve everything for your kids at every point in time, I'm not sure how they deal with things when they go wrong. I really don't. So I think as a parent, it's quite good to try and hold back from solving every single problem. The kind of parent who rushes into the school the moment the kind of there's an issue and tells everybody that they're wrong and their kid is wonderful. That's not actually very helpful. I have tried a bit to do that. The problem is it goes against one's normal parental instincts. One's normal parental instincts obviously didn't apply to my parents, but for most parents is to kind of run in. But I've tried, particularly as my kids got older, to leave them a little bit. I tell the story, my kind of younger son, he was about 19 and he was at university, and he rang me one day, it was the end of term, and he was trying to get back down from university, and we talked about it in advance. I was going to be in a board meeting the whole day. I was chairing a board meeting the whole day at the end of college. And I'm a single parent now, so my husband passed away, so just me. And so I told him, I can't come pick you up. I'm going to be chairing a board meeting all day. But I'll give you the number for man in a van. You ring up man in a van, book the man in a van to come and bring you back home. I'll pay for it. Be fine. So that was good. So he rings me partway into the board meeting. He says, Mum, I made a mistake. I booked man in a van, but I booked him to pick up all my stuff and drop it off at the same place. I kind of missed, by the way, kind of Man in the Van needs to change their booking system. But anyway, so Man in the Van turned up and said, well, we're not going to take you anywhere because we're going to charge you 20 quid and we're going to pick up all your stuff and put it back down again. So he said, this is a disaster, Mum, you have to come and rescue me. And I said, well, just tell me what your situation is. Well, he said, well, I'm sitting on all my suitcases at my college in the sun. I said, well, fine. Well, I'm going back into my board meeting. It's going to go on for another 6 hours. Text me if something disastrous happens. Otherwise, get yourself a coffee. If you figured it out by the end of 6 hours, that's fine. If you haven't, we'll figure it out in 6 hours' time. So by the time the board meeting finished, he'd figured out getting a friend to pick him up and he came home. What was really interesting is, first of all, it was really hard for me. I spent the whole board meeting kind of checking my phone to see whether something, even though he's like 19, by the way, he's 6'6", and he's sitting in the middle of a kind of college in the sun. I mean, not exactly. But the other thing which was really interesting is, like, the following weekend we went out for dinner and he laid into me. How could you abandon me? I was sitting there and you didn't come and get me, and so on. And I said to him, but you're 19 and you were sitting in the sun. Because for him it was quite a shock that I didn't somehow go and rescue him. So my reflection on this is, first of all, it's incredibly hard. You really, really have to hold yourself in grip not to run out of the board meeting and go and rescue them. But actually, it is quite good if you can do that. Not when they're really little, but increasingly letting them have some small experiences of having to fend for themselves is not the end of the world, and they're incredibly good at figuring it out. He got home, so that was fine. He's still probably mad at me, but there we go.
That's also why you wrote the book, so you can be like, listen, here you go. All right, if you've got more questions, yes.
Yes. Hi, I really enjoyed your book, and I was left wanting more and wanting to know what happened after Oxford. So can you provide a very brief overview of your career? What did you do immediately? How did it pan out?
Yeah, sure. So I got to Oxford. The book ends with me kind of walking into Oxford pretty much. As I kind of mentioned briefly before, what was quite interesting is I thought when I got to Oxford that the academic side was going to be really hard because I had these big gaps in my academics. Like I never learned my times tables. I think now I know I'm dyslexic, so I knew that I was terrible at spelling. I hadn't done. I was studying biology. I hadn't ever studied chemistry, which was a prerequisite for the course, which they let me off. So I was really worried about that as well. Funnily enough, actually, academically, it turned out to be okay. Because this kind of being able to teach myself, I taught myself, and actually it's a bit like learning, I guess it's a bit like maybe if you'd learnt to run on the moon, all of a sudden I found myself in a situation where I could go to a lecture and somebody would tell me all this stuff. It was fantastic. And I could walk into a library that was full of books. It's wonderful. So the academic side was tough, but actually okay. And then the social side, which I thought was going to be fantastic. 10 years sitting on a boat, suddenly there I am with all these people. It's going to be like kind of wall-to-wall parties. Turned out to be disastrous, at least to start with. I mean, it was as basic as I just don't think I had the social skills to deal with my peers. And frankly, I don't think they knew how to deal with me anyway, so we had nothing in common, hadn't watched any of the same television programs, never listened really to any pop music. I think I knew, I'd heard of Boy George and I'd heard of kind of, Michael Jackson, that was about it. Nobody liked those, by the way, The Cure was the whole thing when I was at university. I never heard of The Cure. No, but more seriously, I couldn't do small talk, so that was really difficult. But eventually, I think by the end of my degree, I think I at least kind of got better at that. And I did a PhD, also in science, and then I decided I didn't want to be an academic, so I applied for the civil service and joined the civil service fast stream because I thought it'd be intellectually interesting. This kind of curiosity. I've always kind of gone for the thing that looks like it's going to be the most interesting, even if it feels like I might fail. So then I joined the civil service, worked in the Treasury for 4 or 5 years, which is where I met my late husband, Jeremy Heywood. And then we decided to get married, and I decided it was time to go do something else, partly because he was going to stay in the civil service. So I went and joined McKinsey, and I was in McKinsey for quite a long time, became a senior partner at McKinsey, partly because every time I thought I might leave, I thought about leaving a few times, because actually I really enjoyed McKinsey overall. Anyone who's done consulting will know good days and bad days, but overall I enjoyed it. I learnt a ton. But every time I thought about leaving, Jeremy had a crisis. We had another general election, we got another prime minister, something else happened. David Cameron called another kind of referendum on something. It seemed to happen all the time. Anyway, but eventually I said, that's it, I'm leaving. And I found the role at Exor, which was great. And funnily enough, 3 months after I joined Exor, we had the Brexit referendum. So it's a good job I got out when I did, because then, that was a massive crisis for the UK civil service. And then I've been at Exor since 2016. And now oversee our kind of portfolio of companies.
Cool. That's 1, 2, 3 questions. Right, very rapid questions. 1, 2, 3.
So I'm going to ask a question about traumas. You mentioned about your childhood traumas and kind of also looking at potential talent and profiles to either invest in or employ who had, let's say, non-conventional backgrounds one way or another. But it's always like this thin line between those who are self-aware and who grew this kind of self-awareness with time, but those who also could be on the extreme opposite side of things and were like not a good idea. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can tell a bit whether somebody, if they come from a traumatic background, I guess you can tell a lot by kind of interviewing them and understanding what they've done, whether they are somebody who is, how they've been affected by that background. In a way, are they part of the 3/4 or are they part of the quarter? it is interesting. I was able for many years with my background just to put it in the back of my head. It wasn't that I particularly processed it, I just kind of put it behind me. And I was just completely focused on creating a new life for myself here in the UK. You know, I was going to go to university, I was going to start a job, and then got married, had a family. And for a lot of that time, I put the whole background kind of in the back of my head. I knew it was there. I'm not sure I had processed it, but the good thing was it wasn't really affecting me day to day. You know, it wasn't that I was, you know, I didn't have kind of, I wasn't drinking or heavily or any of the rest of it. And then when I came to write the book, I had to confront it. And that was actually a really healthy thing to do in the end, because actually writing a book about something, you really, really have to confront it. And after my husband passed away, I actually did a little bit of therapy, because on my work medical insurance, you can do therapy sessions. So I got 10. I thought I was going to talk about the fact that I'd been widowed, and I thought, but actually I ended up talking about my parents. And my poor psychologist, because she thought that this was going to be, you know, kind of bereavement counselling. Actually, it really wasn't, because that's just sad, not complicated. It was like, okay, now let me tell you this crazy story about how when I was 7 years old, I got dragged away on this boat. Anyway, the thing I was saying, I'm kind of English underneath my crazy childhood, and English people don't really do therapy. We really don't. We think it's a bit kind of odd in general, I think. If I speak for most people I know. But I've now changed my view on that. I think it was really helpful. I mean, I only did the 10 sessions, but it was really, really helpful, because, you know, if you get somebody who, and I found somebody who was really good actually, they will ask you really interesting questions. So I guess coming back to your question, first of all, you can tell, I think, pretty quickly whether somebody is still traumatized, and, you know, that trauma either isn't well packaged away or hasn't been processed. I think you can tell. You know, you can tell because often they will exhibit things like even kind of addictions, those sorts of things. And then, you know, I think if you come from that sort of background, I now do recommend to people, it is worth kind of doing therapy. That actually, I sound very American now, but it really is worth it. It kind of helped me, as did kind of writing about it. So I now feel I'm quite a different person than I was before, because before it was all in the back of my head and it wasn't really bothering me day to day, and I went on and I had a very successful career. Now I feel like I've almost come out, like I've kind of admitted to myself and admitted to the whole world that I had this kind of crazy, mad childhood, and I've kind of processed it, and I feel much calmer about it. So it actually is better to kind of do that, but it took me a while to be ready to do it.
All right, so we had the last two questions. So I think, yeah, you were one, and then you were ready there.
Thank you very much. Mine is just very, very quick and short one. Have you seen Yes, Minister? And if you did, what's your best character?
Well, I mean, the best character has to be Bernard, but that's mainly because, I mean, Bernard's a great character. Bernard's the principal private secretary to the minister. My husband played that role in multiple, because he was a civil servant, and he was Tony Blair's principal private secretary. And then he became, and then he spent a little bit of time in the private sector, came back, was Gordon Brown's principal private secretary, then the head of 10 Downing Street, and then cabinet secretary to Cameron, May, Cameron and Clegg, and then May, and then Cameron on his own, and then May. So I saw him kind of play the Bernard role at various different levels, and I played it briefly myself, because in my 4 or 5 years in the Treasury, I was a private secretary to the financial secretary. And so that's my favourite character, because you're interfacing, you have this kind of weird, you're in this really weird position if you're the private secretary to a minister, because you're both a civil servant and therefore part of your department and loyal to your department, but you're also loyal to your minister because you're their private secretary. So you play this kind of really interesting and quite tricky but fascinating interface role between those two worlds. So yeah.
Glad it's not Humphrey.
No.
Right, one last question.
Hi, thank you for sharing your story with us today. So this is probably one for everyone in the room, but obviously you've told us sort of what you experienced as a child and everything that you went through and everything that you've gone on to achieve today. So given your experience and now today everything that you've kind of been exposed to, the different people that I'm sure you've spoken to, if there were 3 sort of major life lessons that you had to share with us today to really kind of package all of that away and still kind of thrive and become your best self and achieve things that I'm sure you probably never thought were possible, what would those be?
Wow, okay. I'm trying to distill my whole life lessons into 3, which maybe... so one is this kind of resilience thing, you know, kind of... Even if you haven't been through something really traumatic, you probably know somebody who has. You know, my kind of colleagues here from Ukraine certainly will have. And I know it sounds really odd, but it's worth bearing in mind what really is a problem and what isn't a problem. Because I do see so many people in life who kind of, something which really is not a problem, you know, somebody's dented their car or they've lost their wallet or, I don't know, things which, I'm trying to think of things which are genuinely annoying and disruptive, but they're not life-changing. And just trying to get those into perspective, you know, none of those things are going to change your life. You know, you probably won't even remember them in 6 months' time. Yes, it's a big issue, but don't let that disrupt everything. And of course, anyone here who's a founder working in a startup, I mean, and I've been close to a few startups, you're forever dealing with that. I mean, you have so many setbacks, and that ability to kind of put it in proportion and keep going, I think is a huge kind of thing. I think what would be my other ones? There's definitely something about this learning thing, kind of staying curious. Lots of people don't stay curious. And part of staying curious for me is, you know, if you see an opportunity to do something that's a bit tangential to what you're doing, even if it's a bit scary, to jump into something else, actually, I've always found that really reinvigorating. You do have to accept that when you do it, you sometimes go backwards a bit. So, for example, when I went from the Treasury to McKinsey, I definitely went backwards. You know, I was in the first rung of the senior management in the Treasury, and then I went back to being pretty much the most junior person in McKinsey. And likewise, even when I moved to Exor, I kind of went backwards a bit before I kind of went forwards. But you end up as a much stronger person, so that's really important. And then I think the third thing is, it's actually something I learned from my husband. He had an incredibly busy job, but he had an amazing ability to be present in the moments when he was present. So a lot of people have said to me, and they've asked my kids this too, since he kind of passed away, well, you know, don't you feel that you never saw your father because he was busy dealing with every crisis that was happening, working for various different prime ministers and so on? And they don't feel like that, which is really kind of weird because he was really busy. But what he was amazingly good at doing is when he was home with the kids, he was like 100% focused on them. Now, he would then go off and check it was BlackBerry at the time, but go and check his BlackBerry or his phone or whatever. But then when he was with them, he was really focused. And I think the ability to be really intensely focused on the thing that you're doing is a huge skill, and it's one that it's very easy to forget, you know, kind of end up, you know, you're kind of with your kids or with your friend, but you're half watching your phone or something. And I learned that from him. Actually, a fourth one, which I also learned from him, is he was an incredible networker. He was just an instinctive networker. He just loved talking to people. So most days he would have a lunch with somebody. He'd often have a dinner with somebody. He was always talking to people. And he had this thing about every conversation he had, he'd find one interesting thing coming out of it, whether it was a connection or an idea or something. And in fact, it used to be quite trying. We'd go for a dinner together and he would come out and he'd go, right, what did you learn? You know, what was the thing? But that is a really good skill. It's not my natural skill, but I learned it from him and it's served me really well. And it's a really good skill to practice early on because the people who you meet early in your career often will then grow up with you and become very senior later on, and that's incredibly helpful for them and for you. Sorry, that's 4, but I kind of thought of 4 ones I was going on.
No, great, and actually thank you all for the questions. They were very insightful. I think this is a perfect closing question since it's a lot of takeaways. So, Suzanne, thanks for being here. Like we mentioned, there are some books available just outside, I think. And you're willing to sign them, so if anybody has already a copy and wants to get one and come, well, I can just say thank you, and maybe next time you want to take a jump backwards, you can join our firm. wasn't ready to coach.
What is your name? It's interesting because leaving a company. I was on a short 9-month job for a company called National. I'm sure you know them. You could after next door. One second. No, sir.
Yes, we've got the sponsors.
Yeah.
And third viewers.
Yeah.
Yeah, shall we just...
I mean, we missed the moment.
Let's go.
Is that everybody?
Yeah.
I think so.
Well, actually, you've got one handy.
Yeah.